Good afternoon. I'm Theresa Skorseth. This is Robin Hensel, and we have a guest here today. Let's get into Can We Talk? Our guest today is Karen Schraufnagel. She is the founder of Minnesotans Against Islamophobia. And I'd like to start with a little background so we can catch up here. How did you get involved and how did you found Minnesotans Against Islamophobia?
So it has not been that long, really. I've been very active in Justice for Palestine for a very long time. But in January of 2016, I got invited into a national ad hoc group that ended up being called Standing Together Against Racism and Islamophobia, but when it was first called together, it didn't have a name. It was just people all around the country who wanted to respond together to the rising tide of Islamophobia, especially brought about by the rhetoric of coming out of the Republic. At that time, it was Ted Cruz was still in the, all the Republicans were still in the race, and they were out Islamophobing each other. It was pretty horrible. And so this ad hoc group came together and called for a national week of action in February
Of 2016?
Of 2016. So it went from February 13th to the 21st. It was a generous week. So a week of action, having teach-ins, having protests, having, vigils to say that we won't tolerate this level of violent rhetoric and the escalation in Islamophobic attacks that we saw being sort of given impunity by the rhetoric. So I didn't know exactly how to respond to the assignment to have an event in the Twin Cities where I live. So I called on all the peace and social justice people that I knew from my already being active in peace and social justice, and we had a meeting and we decided to have an event on February 20th, and we decided to call ourselves Minnesotans Against Islamophobia. If you don't live in the Twin Cities, you know that Twin Cityans are completely, we just say Minnesotans, and then we don't include anyone outside the Twin Cities. So we want to, and we're happy to welcome Little Falls into the Minnesotans Against Islamophobia community. So that's how it started. We had a fantastic event in February, and people wanted us to keep going, and there was certainly plenty of work to do. Mm-hmm. So really, many of the topics I'm totally new to. I didn't know anything about, like, say, the Countering Violent Extremism program that we'll talk about. I didn't know anything about that in January of 2016. And now I'm supposed to know quite a lot, so we'll see.
Well, let's talk about Countering Violent Extremism. This is a new program. Mm-hmm. I've got two definitions in here, and I'm going to read this one first.
From the Massachusetts ACLU.
Right. Okay, and their take is CVE is a law enforcement model that originated in the United Kingdom, mm-hmm. premised on the discredited idea that harboring certain political or religious views is an indicator of future violence. Mm-hmm. Historically, CVE efforts have targeted specific communities, seeking people who might display so-called vulnerabilities to ideological or political radicalization, in contrast to proven counterterrorism strategies that focus on violent threats or behaviors. The CVE model asks parents, teachers, religious leaders, health and social service professionals, and law enforcement personnel to track and report to the government people engaged in protected First Amendment political speech and thoughts in ways that violate civil liberties without making our communities safer. So this is horrible. Yes. This is a witch hunt. It's McCarthyism all over again, mm-hmm. except it's got a smaller community that it's targeting,
right,
and a very vulnerable one. Okay, so how long has CVE been operating?
So we have in the Minneapolis / the Twin Cities is a pilot city for the Countering Violent Extremism program. It started it depends who you ask. Sometime in 2012, 2013, but it's even early 2014, depends, because they rolled it out really slowly, and there's all these different agencies involved, and they're technically piloting it in Boston after the Boston Marathon shootings, and Los Angeles and the Twin Cities. They've had much less cooperation in Boston and Los Angeles, so Minnesota, the Twin Cities is really leading the way, but they say that this program will go national. It's hard to say now that Trump was elected. It would definitely have gone national under Clinton. Andy Lugar, who runs it for the state of Minnesota, who's the U.S. attorney for the state of Minnesota, and he's like the point person for CVE, he was using the publicity of the trials that we'll talk about later as well to possibly be Hillary Clinton's attorney general. So if he had become attorney general, we would definitely have seen CVE all across the country. We probably still will, but it's a Homeland Security program. It's Department of State is involved, the FBI, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and then they bring in all the local law enforcement people. And so it's a very broad, and then of course they're recruiting teachers, social workers. They trying to get into, like, say, the big brothers and big sisters. They want to be in sort of every social program that exists. And I think that it's one of the things that I've done a lot of anti-racism work over the years, and one of the things that we try to talk about is imagine, because people say countering violent extremism, how can that be bad? We're all
nobody's for it.
Yeah, so if you say you're against the countering violent extremism program, you sound like you're for violent extremism, which is the way, that they get you. But of course, it's hard for people to imagine maybe regular people that just lead regular lives, what it is to be in the eyes of this program, to be in its sights. And so, maybe you can imagine if you're a parent of a teenager and the teenager is getting involved with drinking and skipping school and some of the problematic behaviors that teenagers get involved in, maybe staying out too late on a Friday night and you have no idea. And you go to the people that you would go to for help with this. Maybe you're the religious clergy that you're close to, or the teachers at the school, or other parents. In the Countering Violent Extremism program, all these people are watching these kids, but instead of pulling them back, they push them forward. So if all the people that were trying to help you get your child to stop drinking, stop engaging in other risky behaviors that a teenager might engage in, if instead of saying to the kids, you know what, drinking, we understand that you might try drinking, but at least do it in a safe way. Don't drink and drive. Don't skip school. Do some of these behaviors in a safe way. So instead of saying that, the people that you're trusting to help you are saying, alcohol's good, but have you tried speed? Have you tried heroin? So this is what the Countering Violent Extremism program is like. These kids have ideas that a lot of times they're just questioning U.S. foreign policy, which hopefully we all do a little bit, U.S. foreign policy, and so they're wondering about what's happening in Syria. They're wondering about why all these Muslim countries are being bombed. They're wondering what they can do to help their fellow Muslims around the world, and they're being told you should consider joining ISIS. You should look at these are the groups that are fighting back, and so you need to look into them. Their parents are being told, take away their passports. So that then the kids are trying to get passports. That's what happened in the trial. They were trying to get fake passports. That's what they were actually caught for. Well, so that's all the avenues that would de-escalate are being closed, and they're being pushed in the direction of escalation. This person, Trevor Aronson, has written this fantastic book called The Terror Factory, and it talks about it talks about how the FBI is creating terrorists so that they can prosecute terrorists. And rather than actually doing the hard undercover work and investigation that's involved in actually catching criminals, they focus all their energy on what's considered entrapment, really, by a regular person would think. Well, if the undercover agent is making all of everything about the crime possible, if they've given them the idea, if they're facilitating it at every juncture, then isn't that entrapment? So I mean, I hope when we talk about the trial, we'll get to that. I didn't mean to divert us totally
that's okay. I find it interesting because what you seem to be saying is, instead of actually putting the effort into finding out what's driving the problem, whatever the problem may be, and defining the problem to begin with, they're just sort of funneling young people into a trap whereby they can say, okay, look, we've prevented something horrible from happening by arresting these children.
And then the other thing that's so important is that they are in the Somali community doing this. So they have decided something's called countering violent extremism. Well, what about Christian extremists? What about Jewish extremists? What about extremists that don't identify with any religion? Extremism and terrorism, which they're using them interchangeably, that sort of violence for political ends, it goes across the board. In fact, white Christian men commit the vast majority of domestic terrorism. So, I mean, why aren't people with a propensity to bomb abortion clinics being targeted in this particular way? So if I were to say to you, I have a program to combat obesity. Obesity is a problem with our youth, but we're not going to talk about the sugary drinks that they drink. We're not going to go after any products that they might consume. Instead, we're going to have this program in schools, and if we spot people that we think are prone to obesity, we're going to intervene. But of course, we're going to intervene in a way that makes it worse and is shaming and all, and maybe arrest them. But anyway, and then I say, it's called Targeting Obesity. It's called Project Obesity, but we're going to focus entirely on the Greek population. And this does two things. It misses all the obesity as a general problem that doesn't involve Greek people, and it makes it seem like Greeks are synonymous with obesity, right? So this program, by saying it's about targeting violent extremism, but actually focusing only on the Somali community, it reinforces this idea that Somalis are terrorists, and nobody else is. There's no other terrorism problem, and that's what they are. It defines them. So it's a very serious problem. The narrative behind it is even more serious than the program itself.
That's terrible.
Huh?
So you said that Minneapolis has become the pilot city.
Yeah.
I assume that that's because Minneapolis has the largest Somali population in the country.
Right.
How did Boston and LA become?
Well, Boston, I think because of the marathon bombings, right? So it's really big. It's a post 9/11 program. So since the war on terror, we have become obsessed nationally, coming out of Washington, with the idea of preventing the next terror attack, right? And of course that means focusing on the Muslim world, because of course we don't acknowledge
That it happens
violence
elsewhere.
from a terroristic type of violence. I mean, Oklahoma City was Christian, right-wing Christian, right? But we didn't institute a program to go into churches and schools to target Christian youth and say we need to prevent the next Oklahoma City. But so that we are obsessed, and I really think I'm speaking for myself here, that the war on terror abroad and Islamophobia at home are two sort of sides of the same coin. They feed each other. So we have to demonize Islam as a religion and say that it's a violent religion, so that we can do the level of violence that we're doing to these predominantly Muslim countries around the world, so that we cannot care about the consequences of terrorism when it targets Muslims. And so at home we have to hate Muslims so that we can do these wars abroad. And so I think it feeds each other. And we say in Minnesotans Against Islamophobia, we say that CVE, the Countering Violent Extremism Program, is institutionalizing Islamophobia, because it's taking Islamophobic assumptions. The assumption that Muslims are terrorists is an Islamophobic assumption. It's what people scream at Muslim women as they're ripping off their hijabs. They say, terrorists. It's what they're bullying them in school with the
children and
and they say terrorists, and the women are so visible in the hijab. So here at home, we identify Muslims as terrorists so that we can bomb Muslim countries abroad. CVE takes that assumption that Muslims are terrorists and creates a whole institutional program, law enforcement program, arrests, prosecution. So that makes it so that individuals, this is why I say institutionalized, because individuals no longer have to be Islamophobes. If you have a criminal justice program that is targeting and punishing Muslims for being Muslim, and it really does, the list of criteria for what defines you as at risk to become a violent extremism includes women when they start wearing the hijab, men if they dress American most of the time, let's say during Ramadan they put on the religious garb. This is seen, it's not seen as a sign that you're identifying with your religion, it's seen as you're becoming an extremist. So if they're talking about what's happening in Muslim countries around the world, that's another, watch, another red flag. So it's very...
It's like a thought police and Big Brother
Right.
watching out. It's horrifying to think that we're coming to this again, but we seem to do this in cycles. And I don't know, Robin, what do you...
It's hard to fathom that in the event a Muslim young person or any age would decide to become more devout in their faith,
Right.
would be targeted and persecuted for that. That's a real travesty.
Right.
And I just want to insert this right here. There will be some upcoming films that I encourage the viewers watching this show to watch. They'll be run at different times on this station. One is Dr. Todd Green, and the topic is Islamophobia, what are we really afraid of.
Right.
And that was filmed at Peace Dock this last October down in Red Wing, Minnesota. Theresa and I have attended, but not this year. Another one is Michael German, and the title of that is The Failure of Our Counterintelligence, and it's discourse or something to that effect. That he's a former FBI agent,
He's wonderful.
and he also spoke at Peace Dock. And then another one is Sami Rassouli, our good friend, a dual citizen from Iraq and the United States. And he used to own Sinbad's restaurant in
Right.
the Twin Cities. And he's a real
Gem.
strong component of social justice and rebuilding of Iraq through the water project that they have there. Najaf, Iraq, and Minneapolis are sister cities. And they came together in part because of this water program, as I'm told anyway. So watch for those films that are going to be on this. And I don't know what's happening in the metro other than I attended a program at the River Center, I believe it was, and it was called Minnesota We Are One. And after that program, I went up and spoke with Kevin Lindsay, the director of Human Rights, Minnesota Department of Human Rights, and asked if Little Falls could be first on the list to receive that program or an extension of that program here, because we really need it. This county, and Little Falls in particular, has been bombarded with Islamophobic speakers for really since 2012. And if it was before that, I'm not aware of it. But Bridget Gabriel, real name Hannah Tudor, came here to speak. She's the founder, of course, of Act for America, who are listed as one of the extremist groups with the Southern Poverty Law Center. She spoke at the high school here, spring or summer of 2012. And really since that time, things have escalated here in this area. And this is recent. I found this, I get a lot of updates from the Minnesota Department of Human Rights, and St. Cloud has just hired a enforcement officer whose name is Heidi Hovis. And they are bringing her in, I'm sure in part because of things that have escalated in the St. Cloud area. And they have found a need to have an officer there to make sure that everyone's human rights are respected, and I think that's a good thing for this area. I'm trying to think if it was 2013, I invited in one of the enforcement officers to come to speak at City Council here, and I asked our city to develop a human rights commission. Council promptly decided they weren't interested in that, and the outgoing councilman who I ran against this fall, Lauren Boyum, I asked his help to promote a human rights commission here, and in fact he stifled it and I think helped shut down the idea of one. A human rights commission, in part, is created to help mediate lawsuits before they actually occur. And this area is quite in need of that, in my opinion. Anyway,
It's a good thing everywhere.
you know, we've had speakers here locally. Ron Branstner, who's a car salesman from the St. Cloud area, and he speaks about refugees and immigrants and what a dangerous trend, what a costly trend it is to bring in more refugees and how we shouldn't be doing that anymore. That's his basic talk that he gives. John Guandalo, former disgraced FBI member, has also spoken here at a private event. I think it was held at the Senior Center, but it wasn't open to the public. And he runs a program, you probably are aware of it. It's called Threats, Understanding the Threats, the Threat, and he goes into law enforcement communities, actual agencies, and teaches on jihad and different things. And there are a lot of people here locally, as well as through central Minnesota, that just suck this stuff up. They're
Right.
just fascinated with it.
Right.
They rush to these meetings. Theresa and I have attended a couple different ones. Usama Dekduk is another, he's a Coptic Christian pastor from Egypt. He's another one that rails against Muslims and claims that
There's
Allah
satanic.
is Satan,
Yeah.
and I mean, absolute garbage.
Just horrible stuff.
And I don't know if it was this exact billboard that was in St. Cloud. It was something like this. This one is from the Center of Security Policy. CSP is one of the initiators of a lot of this stuff. Frank Gaffney's connected with that organization, Bridget Gabriel, Claire Lopez, a number of others, and they are all listed as extremist, and the Center for Security Policy is listed as an extremist group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Interesting, on the bottom of this says, should America fear Sharia.com? And it says past donors include General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Boeing. Those are all war profiteers.
Contractors, yes, exactly.
And SCAIF Foundation, that's SCAIFE, and also Bradley Foundation. I don't know about those.
Yeah,
But-
they're both-
And then many donors request anonymity. Well, we know why. In order to make war, you have to have a reason to make war. Even if it means drumming up false reasons. And we now some of us were aware of it before the Iraq illegal invasion, but now we are told by most of the major news sources as well as intelligence agents that we were lied to. We were lied into the war in Iraq. So basically, all the soldiers, American soldiers, died for what? A lie? I think so. And there's a direct tie between, like you said, all the driving and the inspiration of hate against Muslims to get us into more countries to make more war on.
Yes.
It's so much easier to inspire hate than understanding. I mean, it's just, all you have to do is just a touch is all it takes. Just start a little rumor, just make a little mention, and people are eager to get on that bandwagon and become part of the heroes who are going to save America, and they don't realize that they're being hustled into taking a position that will support America's immoral activities. I'm just reading a bit here about a case in England where a college student falsely reported to authorities as a potential extremist simply for attending a meeting about Gaza, and a 9-year-old boy was referred to authorities for deprogramming purposes. How do you take a child of 9 and deprogram him or her
Right.
from his religion?
And we don't have the deprogramming structure. I think part of what's challenging is that the U.S. has taken programs to help people back from the extremist, slippery slope of extremists. We've taken the programs we've taken the law enforcement model from other countries in Europe, but in Europe, they are applied after the fact. Meaning, if somebody comes back from Syria, they went to join ISIS, they changed their mind, and they came home, and they need to be deprogrammed for real. They were a member of a terrorist organization, and they need, just like if you get out of a cult here, there's a certain amount of relearning what is acceptable behavior in the society where you live. Now, all of us maybe have a little trouble with what the normative behavior might be, but taking that as a given. So the problem is that we take this model that talks about challenging violent extremism, but we do it preemptively. We do it for thinking
Because maybe
thoughts.
someday you might do something.
Right, we're doing it, and because we have this rationale, the US government has this idea that they're preventing the next 9/11, they just see terrorist threats everywhere, right? And since they don't care about the population that's being infiltrated, they don't care about their civil rights, and they get to say that, it's more important to prevent this next attack than it is to respect the rights of the communities that are living under surveillance and such. So we take this policy that is intended to help integrate back into society people who have actually come back to their country from trying to join an actual organization that's on our terrorism watch list. And instead, we couple that within this country, we have something called conspiracy to provide material support for a designated foreign terrorist organization, right? Right, so there's material support for a designated foreign terrorist organization, and this law is so incredibly vague, and it goes back to actually the lawsuit, the challenge in the Supreme Court. It was called Eric Holder was our Attorney General, versus the Humanitarian Law Project. That was on the other side of it, and it was doctors who tried to help tsunami victims in Sri Lanka. So to help tsunami victims in Sri Lanka, they had to work with the Tamil Tigers, because the Tamil Tigers control vast swaths of Sri Lanka. And this was considered providing material support to foreign terrorist organization, because the Tamil Tigers are on a designated foreign terrorist. They're on a list, right? And in order to work in that region, you have to work with them. Just like Jimmy Carter could be on the list, because he's worked with Hamas in order to see if the elections in Gaza are being done fairly. You have to work with the governing body. If you want to see if the elections in Colombia are being done fairly and people are not being targeted for violence and they try to vote, you might have to work in areas that are dominated by FARC. FARC is on the terrorism watch list. Any of these activities is considered material support for a designated foreign terrorist organization. So it's an incredibly vague law that can get virtually anybody in trouble. But of course, much of our justice system is like that, and it's vague, and then only certain people end up getting caught up in it because other people are treated differently, and that's a huge problem. If you're, an immigrant, you're black, you're Muslim, you're much more likely to be in the target than if you're a nice, white Christian boy. So
like probably any of us. That's another aspect of white privilege that we don't often we don't.
You're not targeted.
Yeah, and what must it be like to know that everywhere you go, everything you do, everyone you meet, everything you say, somebody's watching and waiting for you to just pronounce a certain word, and then that's it. From that point on, your whole life is in their hands.
I won't take time to read this, but I want the viewers to make sure to not miss this article. It's Meet Frank Gaffney, the anti-Muslim gadfly, reportedly advising Trump's transition team. And if I had to make a prediction about the Trump administration, it will be more of a focus on all of what we're talking about, that will make it harder and harder for decent Muslims, no matter what their country of origin is, no matter when they came here, no matter how they came here, and most especially the women and the girls who are wearing the hijab, that will openly identify themselves as being a Muslim. I think this administration is going to make it very difficult for our Muslim community, and that's troubling.
Right.
I want to insert right here something that I think I don't have. I've, as you can see, I have stacks and stacks, volumes of information, and I have read almost 100% of that.
That's very impressive.
Following article after article about the issue of Muslims being targeted, Muslims being treated differently, Muslims being bullied, so on and so forth. Almost every incident, including the Orlando shooter, has stated emphatically in one way or another that the reason they did what they did was to help their fellow Muslim brothers and sisters in other countries, that they see what's happening there is just flat out wrong. Including 12 times Mateen asks the United States to stop bombing and killing Iraqi and Syrians with the airstrikes, the drone assassinations,
Right.
and bombings. 12 times he states this, and this is the actual testimony that he gave. The first time he says, because you have to tell America to stop bombing Syria and Iraq. This is what actually occurred between him and the 9/11 call that he made, talking to the dispatcher. Because you have to tell America to stop bombing Syria and Iraq, they are killing a lot of innocent people. What am I to do here when my people are getting killed over there? You get what I'm saying? Then he goes on to say, you need to stop the U.S. airstrikes. They need to stop the United States airstrikes, okay? Then he says, and there's in between the dispatchers talking as well, but I won't read that part. They need to stop the United States airstrikes. You have to tell the United States government to stop bombing. They're killing too many children. They're killing too many women, okay? The next thing he says after the dispatcher says something, what's going on is that I feel the pain of the people getting killed in Syria and Iraq and all over the Muslim, and then some unidentified word. He says again after a number of things that the dispatcher says, well, you need to know that they need to stop bombing Syria and Iraq. The United States is collaborating with Russia, and they are killing innocent women and children, okay? Then he says, call me Mujahideen, call me the soldier of God. So, and there may be more. Oh, yes, there is at the end here. One of the last things he says, the negotiator says, tell me what's going on now, Omar. And Omar says, what's going on is that the airstrikes need to stop. They need to stop. The airstrikes need to stop. They need to stop killing people. He couldn't have been more precise in what he was asking for than what he did here. This was his call, that he sees what's going on is wrong. And I'm not agreeing with what he did. Certainly was criminal and wrong what he did. But we need to understand the flack that's coming back to America in the form of terrorism is direct blowback from our wars. Just like Colleen Rowley and Todd Pierce, Judge Advocate General, sat right in this room and stated emphatically, if we continue to aggress on countries and force our full spectrum dominance, our perpetual war on other nations, this is going to increase. Yeah. At what point do the people in leadership position that control the military actions, will they ever get it?
I think they get it. I'm sorry, but I think this is pretty deliberate, pretty self-aware. They know what they're doing. They're creating a situation, and I don't know why.
War profit.
Well, yeah, war profit.
That's it.
always
Bottom
the
line,
obvious.
money.
Yeah.
Money
And then
greed.
what is actually the blowback for the wars becomes the justification
Right.
for the wars.
Exactly.
And this, because I like I say, I come to a lot of this from doing Palestine solidarity activism, and Israel is the absolute king, queen, whatever, number one in terms of covering up the provocation and then using the response as the justification. So the way that they oppress the Palestinian population, and then after all of the humiliation, all of the control that's exerted on the Palestinian population of Palestine, after that you might get a small response. You might get a large response, like a suicide bombing, but you might get just a little bit of like throwing a stone at a soldier or something. That is then seen as an act that comes out of nowhere, comes out of irrational hatred, and then justifies what Israel does next. So this is, I think that the US has actually sort of learned this from Israel instead of the other way around, although, you know, Hitler said during World War II, the Nazi leadership all said that they learned about their extermination plans from the way the US treated the Indian population here. So it's, you know, I'm not saying that the US has not been good at this for a very long time, but, you know, there is a justification. I mean, there is a reason, which is, you know, war is very profitable for the industries that are profiting from it. So, and the war footing, and then the security state, which I think is probably what Todd and Colleen are also talking about, the security state that we live in here, which is justified by the war footing that we live under.
So it just goes around and around and around, and where it stops, and nobody knows. This sort of reminds me a little bit of Standing Rock. The hired thugs there saying, "Oh, somebody threw a rock at me, so I've got the right to, you know, spray them with a water cannon." And whether or not anyone threw a rock, you know, if I were there, I'd be throwing more than a rock. But, so it's a good thing I'm not there, because I have a hard time, and I so admire the people who are able to maintain under those circumstances. But again, it's exactly the same thing. You can always justify hatred and violence toward another group. It's very easy, and it's so easy for the people hearing you to say, "Oh yeah, I get that, I feel that. And America now is operating on an emotional level far more than an intellectual or civil discourse level. All we have to do is make a suggestion, and the whole country just falls into line. And you were talking about security issues and the security complex in America. There's a lot of money running around in that business as well. So this is keeping a whole lot of people employed at a pretty handsome salary.
Yeah.
Another thing I want to point out to the listeners is to not pass this by. This is excellent. This is written by Dr. Todd Green, and it is a study guide put out by Lutheran Social Service of Minnesota for Changing Lives. My Neighbor is a Muslim, a small group study exploring the Muslim faith. And one of the contributing biographers, well, actually Todd Green, wrote The Fear of Islam, An Introduction to Islamophobia in the West. That's another book that people might want to get. This is recommended actually to be done as part of a Sunday school teaching in your church. And it talks in here about opening up avenues to make your community more diverse. And this is a good guide to help with that. And I want to talk about hate crimes in Minnesota and how the Somali community, I've done a lot of reading about Somalis when they were in their own country. It's a very private group of people. They don't like talking publicly about stuff. And I think there's some difficulty for fear reasons, possibility of putting yourself out there and then being more targeted or more harassed if you speak out and you are a Muslim. So how, knowing that, how can we as white allies, as Christian or non, but be just people in the general community, how can we be more strongly allied with them when it's harder to get them to speak up and out about what's happening with them? That's one thing. And then the hate crimes, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the hate crime that happened here in Little Falls. My friend Anam had two men come to her home at 10 o'clock at night and threaten that Muslims weren't welcome here, and that if she and her family didn't leave, they would burn her house down. And that's supposedly under the investigation now of the FBI. That's what I'm told by Chief Shermers.
The
And-
chief of police.
Yeah. And there's more to this story that I'm not going to discuss because I don't want to make it any more difficult for this family than they already are having. But there have been incidences in the school this year, again. One of the first things that was said to one of the girls in this family was, "What are you, ISIS?"
Right.
Because she was wearing a hijab. And now after the hate crime, there's been at least one other incident in school, and I'm not going to go into that right now. But Theresa and I know from our experiences with having multiracial children, she has biological African American children, and I have adopted African American children, biracial and African American. This school system is, you use your words.
Well, it's hard to, okay, it starts at the top. The faculty and the administrative officers are not doing anything about racist incidents when they erupt. It's hard because the kids are not like standing up on stage and saying, "I hate you because you're black." They're sneaking up behind the black children in the hallways and, saying terrible things and then pretending that they didn't say it and looking around for the person who did it. It's just
Right.
this horrible, nasty kind of thing that children everywhere do for whatever reasons,
Right.
but in this case it's a racist thing. And I've been to the school, talked to the administrators, tried to find some way that we can work on this. I've suggested that they do programs during Black History Month that would address racism. They didn't care to do that.
They don't even have a Martin Luther King Day. They don't do anything to promote and as a group, like say the high school and the middle school, have an actual forum on Martin Luther King and what he did, why he did it, racism and all of it. And this is going back, 25 years. Theresa and I started dealing with the school system here and racism. So it isn't just
No.
pressure against the Muslims. This
This was
school district
9/11.
has a history of racial problems.
Mhm.
And to date, I don't think that they're addressing it properly. There could be a lot more done, let's just say it that way. But talk about hate crimes in the Twin Cities and some of what's happened down there recently.
Well, it's not so different. We've had our share. I think that you all have the actual touring Islamophobes that you mentioned, Robin, earlier. You went down the list of some of the people that have been here speaking. They don't come to the Twin Cities. They come to the outstate, and they make an excellent living touring, Bemidji and suburban Bemidji. I had no idea there was such a thing as suburban Bemidji, but these little towns that are in the outskirts of, and so they're instigating this type of hatred, but of course it's not called that. They're not held responsible for it, but they, so we don't have them. They don't come to places where 30,000 Somalis live, They come to communities where there's 3 Somali families living there, or none, or, because we didn't really talk about the definition of Islamophobia, but Islamophobia being irrational fear and hatred of Muslims, there's the irrational piece, right? So it's easier to make people fear and hate people that they don't know. If I have a personal experience with having several black friends, say, and then you tell me a whole bunch of black stereotypes, I might not believe you, because anti-black stereotypes, I might not believe you because I might have different personal experience that tells me that's not accurate. So these Islamophobes can spew this, ridiculous is not a strong enough word, absolutely absurd unbelievable, incredible things about Islam. And if somebody hearing it doesn't know any Muslims, or maybe knows one but not well enough to ask them some ridiculous question that in your heart it's absurd, so you're not going to ask your Muslim friend, oh, by the way, does your religion advocate the beheading of babies? You're just not, something in your Constitution would stop you from asking that. But we still have the attacks, right? Even without because like I said, the rhetoric's coming out of the campaign, it's coming out of Washington, it's coming out of everywhere, and people have the internet and they have these stations on TV that they can watch, and so they still have the hatred. So we have had attacks. We had some kids that were actually shot at during Ramadan. They were out, they had been playing basketball, and they were walking to the mosque in the middle of the night, because Ramadan, when it's in the summer, the closing prayers are there's basically a period, the last 10 days of Ramadan, where they're pretty much 24 hours a day. There's prayers that are at like 2 o'clock in the morning. So these kids were walking through Dinkytown back to the mosque, and these other kids walked up. They were in a car. But the kids started shooting at them. The young men started shooting at these 5 young men who were on their way to the mosque. So this is part of the fight, is to get it prosecuted as a hate crime, because they were clearly being targeted for their religion. So we had at the U of M, the University of Minnesota, at the Twin Cities campus, graffiti that says Muslims are ISIS. We get that. We get the women having their hijabs pulled off, the young girls being called ISIS, being called terrorists. And we did have an attack in an Applebee's that got quite a lot of attention, where a woman was speaking to her sister in Swahili. There at the Applebee's with her three children and her sister or cousin. But anyway, family gathering at Applebee's, and this couple that was sitting at the table next to them said, speak English. And she said, I can speak English. I'm speaking to my sister. We're comfortable speaking in Swahili. So, but they decide if they can't understand what you're talking about, then you must be plotting a terrorist attack. That's part of the ridiculous level of fear. So, if I can't understand you when you're talking, you must be planning to kill me, right? So there's nothing else that two sisters could be discussing over lunch at Applebee's with their children. So then they say, go home, which of course terrifies the children, because the children were born here. And is terrifying to the parents too. If you're from Somalia and you escaped civil war and you came here and you thought this was the land of the free and the home of the brave and milk and honey and all the myths about America, and you get here and they say go home. So we've had our share, but I do think, I think all of it is a problem. I do think that, and in the second show when we talked some about the trial, I think that the narrative, part of the issue that I have with challenging Islamophobia by having people just meet Muslims, which I think is important. This is one of the strategies. It's Todd Green's strategy where he writes, my neighbor is Muslim. Mm-hmm. It's the strategy of when you have a community get-together and the Islamic Resource Group, and I think they might be all over there in the Twin Cities for sure, of having people from like CARE come and talk to people about what Islam is really about, that Muslim families have the same values as your family. They care about their children's education. They care about feeding and clothing and medical. They care about having a job. They care about the things that everyone cares about. Doing that is a very important piece of resisting Islamophobia, right? Because like I said, if it's irrational, if I know people that don't fit that thing that you're saying to me is what Muslims all think, then I'm going to say, well, no, that doesn't make any sense. So that's important. It is not sufficient because we have policies like CVE that institutionalize these assumptions. So when these assumptions are part of how law enforcement does law enforcement, then it sort of doesn't, people's individual biases become less important. The law enforcement is taken, it's got a mind of its own, just like when they were, prosecuting crack cocaine at 1,000 times the level of powder cocaine. Well, who uses crack cocaine and who uses powder cocaine? So it was the justice system enforcing the racism. So anyway, I'm again blabbering, but
No, you're not. You're making perfect sense, and it is institutionalized. You're right. What do we as non-Muslims, but friends of Muslims, do to help educate people beyond a program like this? I'm trying to think of how, if I had been in Germany when the whole Holocaust was gearing up, what might I have said to other people that would help them to see that resistance is not only okay, but absolutely essential? What can we do?
Well, I mean, again, I do think on a personal level, interrupting is important because it is important. I mean, shining sunlight on irrational fears helps to melt them away. Mm-hmm. So, do you actually know any Muslim people? Well, I know Muslim people, and they're not like any of those things that you said. Did you know that the word Islam means peace? Did you know that Islam is a religion of peace? Would you want Christianity to be blamed for the fanatical acts of a few Christians? Well, there are 1 point however many billion Muslims in the world. It's very simple, it's the same thing to paint a. So I just say personally challenging is important. Now then people, just like racism, they start to understand that they shouldn't say it in front of you, which is not the same thing as not believing it anymore, but they start to understand that, that's my crazy friend that won't tolerate, my racist jokes or whatever.
Right.
So,
but it's I'm sorry to interrupt. We have a minute left, so we're going to have to wrap it up here. But let's begin our next talk with some further suggestions as to what people can do to change the narrative in any community like here, where we have just relatively few Muslim families here and no mosque. So no cleric, no leader. And what could we do here locally? Let's begin with that, and then I'll let you wrap it up, Theresa.
Well, let's wrap it up. If you enjoyed this program, if you find you're learning something and it's important to you, we're going to be doing another hour with Karen, and so watch for that too. They will not run concurrently, but it'll give you something to look forward to on Channel 180 in the future. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Theresa Skorseth with Robin Hensel and our special guest, Karen Schraufnagel.
Very good.
And thank you for watching us on Can We Talk, and we'll see you soon.